Good morning, good afternoon, and maybe good evening. My name is Elsa Clave. I am Assistant Professor of Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Hamburg, and it's a real pleasure to be with you today, although remotely. Before starting, I would like to thank the organizer of the conference, Ibu Professor Melanie Budianta, Bapak Maneke Budiman, Ibu Giti Tambunan, and Bapak Gilman Asilmi for having offered me such an opportunity and for having organized the 5th International University Symposium on Humanities and Arts. Today, I've been invited to reflect on the topic, excavating the past, reimagining the future. The first element that struck me, in fact, is the connection between the different temporality that we have in this topic, the past, the present, and the future. That may seem a very common thing to say, a banality, but I would like to insist on it for two reasons. First, because we often hear, oh, that's the past is the past, do not excavate the past, move on, as if the past could be put in a box and set aside. The second reason why I would like to insist on that is because this connection between the past, the present, and the future could be taken for granted because it's linear, because it's our way, to live the time, and we're used to that. But in fact, it's not as easy as that. So let's call that the first layer. And in this presentation, I would have five, sorry. The first layers is a linear, vision of history. There is the past, the present, and the future. There is no problem. So in fact, we should not even question it. But of course, I would like to move to the second layer to try to get a little closer to what I think is at stake when we talk about history and about excavating the past. And that's in this word, excavating the past. The past is not directly accessible. It's not something that you can retrieve. It needs an effort. You need to find elements and to make them appear at the surface. So those things are not as directly accessible as one may think. There is the past events and there is history. And those things are two different things. Let me explain with an example. What happened to Indonesia yesterday is already the past. What happened a few weeks ago or so. And although you can open a newspaper and look for the events, the history of this recent past is not that easily accessible. You will need an effort to understand it. Because what is important is not so much what happened, but why it happens. What are the conditions which have allowed those events to happen? And to take an example, which is very appropriate for the topic of today, you may all know that a few days ago, the Minister of Education and Research announced that history courses could be optional. And this declaration has provoked a lot of reactions. So what is interesting for historians when we dig is to understand the condition that allow a minister in 2020 to make such a proposition and to have a clear path to make it. And why, for example, this proposition could not be made in some other countries, or why the same proposition has been made in other countries. And my home country is in France, and the same proposition had been made not so long time ago, also by the Minister of Education at that time. But I could also ask other questions, like if I want to go back to a bit older debate, the term Monyet. Why Monyet can be used to talk about Papuan people? Why it is normalized for some people to use this term, why it is not even problematic. So historian asking that will dig, will try to find data sources explaining why mentality in Indonesia could allow that. And that will probably bring us, to some conclusion about a certain colonial mindset. But that's not the topic of today. And here I'm already in the third layer, which is about connections. So history is not past events. History asks efforts, asks some work, you have to work to find those data. And when you have those data, when you have those elements, your work is to make connections. And when you make those connections visible, which is basically the work of a historian, you make the explanation. And the third layer is quite important because the work of a historian is to make connection. So if you have a proposition which is to make history classes optional, it means that connection will be made optional. And then what remain, of course you have Wikipedia, of course you have resources online, but those things are instant information. I do not say that people do not look for more, but most of the time you will have dates, data, facts, but you won't have the connection, or maybe you won't have the will to look for those connections because you won't have the curiosity, because nobody would have, planned that in you. This curiosity is something that is cultivated, and is cultivated a lot in history classes. So let's say we have those dates, those facts, but no connection. Then we have no way to understand why this has happened or why this is happening. And without that, we may really get stuck at the first and the second layers, where you see things as linear and with no problem, or when you think that past events are, history. And of course, it's a real problem. It's a real problem for curiosity, it's a real problem for how you will approach society, but it's a real problem also because the third layer is the most exciting. It's really in the third layer when you start to question things, when you start to look for answer, you won't get satisfied with simple one, with shortcuts. And in fact, this curiosity, this appetite to make connection and to understand can be applied and will be applied to every single fields that you will encounter in your life. That's usually what happens. That's why history lessons are, I think, so important. Let's take example, fake news. Well, you're armed with those fake news to handle it and to be able to carefully read and select information. Discourse of hatred, speeches that arise fear. Well, you also, will be armed with enough tools to handle it and to be able to, not to fall in those traps. Election, political discourse, you will also be capable to look for the important information and take, decision once you're really well informed. But the third layer, it's of course is not all beauty, and it is I would say the ideal plan that I'm now describing, when you got excited by looking for connection, that in fact you find those connections. But very often what happens is that you do not find the connections, and that you've searched for history, search to reconstruct, to understand something, and it remains very difficult to understand. And then you have this beautiful frame, which is the black and white, the good and the bad, which is destroyed, which is not available anymore. And then you have no ground under your feet. And that may be scary, and that's very uncomfortable. But that's also one thing that history teaches you, is that you should not look for comfort zone, and that sometimes reality isn't comfortable, and that you should be able to stand this discomfort, to move forward, and to look, for the answers you're looking for. And sometimes it takes long to have those answers, but it's like this. Historians may just start, the puzzle, start to bring pieces together and never finish it. That's also part of the job, and I would say part of the mentality and what you have to accept. You do not have the keys to the truth. You won't find the truth. You are on the way, and in fact, we are on the way. That's something which is also collective. History is something that you share, is something that you do for others, and others will do. And little by little, you move on. You move forward, and you reconstruct, you build this image of the past, which did not make sense before. And this brings us to the fourth layer. Why sometimes image of the past does not make sense? It's because we already have a frame, because we live in the present, and this present where we are, we've been born and we've been at school, and even if you don't go at school, you're exposed to media, books, movies, music, advertisement, and all those things, in fact, are creating a condition, are passing on ideas and image, and this heritage is internalized and is very often not so conscious, and that's what I call the frame. So we have this frame which is internalized, and that has been inherited by the society where we live, and then you're a historian and you look for the past, for elements, to find the answer to a question which really bother you, and you have elements, but those elements in front of you, those sources, those data, historical data that you've found, they do not match the frame. Then here in this fourth layer, you need imagination. You need imagination. It does not mean that you need to have crazy idea. You need to be able to get out of this frame, to put your pieces in front of you, your data, your sources, and you need to imagine other possibilities. That's a very important condition to build, reconstruct the past. Because if you stay in the frame, you may stay frustrated and never also be able to move on beyond, the actual state of knowledge. So we need imagination, and we need to reimagine. That was in the title of the topic. We have to reimagine the present. And I say the present before the future because very often history is used, not always in a very, I would say, good way. History is used as a tool to control. It's not used to, it should not be used to predict the future, and sometimes you hear non-historians or people with a very non-historical mind thinking or wanted that history become practical. History should serve a purpose, but history is not practical. History is not practical. History is a foundation. History is a way of looking at things, is a way to inquire, to question. So it's something basically to break the frame. It's something to dig. It's not something that should set, very straight rails and a very straight road. But what we see is that very often people use the past to legitimize the present and the future. Legitimize, for example, policies or economical plans, saying that, well, it's like this because it's like this, because by the past we've seen that if you do not do like this, then, a catastrophe or something very bad will happen. So we don't want a reproduction of the past, so let's move with this idea and do not question it. Let me be very clear. This is completely antinomic with what history is, because history is basically questioning, is always trying to understand. So if someone uses, history as an argument for you not to question, for us not to think, we should be very careful and very suspicious about that. I would like to finish by answering 4 questions that have been given to me as a lead for today's talk. And I call them double-edged sword. At the exception of the first one, the three others are really double-edged sword. So for the first one, how do we learn from our history to build a better understanding concerning diversity in our society? Well, I would say that the answer is in the question that history is teaching us diversity. History is teaching us complexity. History is teaching us, you know, as I explained, this capacity to stand complexity. So by definition, learning from our history should, you know, allow a better understanding of diversity and should complexify this idea of diversity, which very often is taken as a, you know, 1 + 1 + 1. But 1 + 1 + 1 is not very diverse, is a multitude. You know, it's several. But several people different, with different language, with different clothes, are not that diverse. And you may have a diversity in a way a little bit more difficult to accept. And that's a, you know, real social problem. And history can really help us to think more and understand more what diversity means, in fact. If I take the three other questions, how do we promote public memory as a means to cope with the crisis? How do we reimagine the future in relation to digital artifacts and cultural heritage? How do we make meaning of the present, digital present, in connection to the past? Those three questions are very good, but can also be dangerous. Dangerous in a way that, well, people, you know, promote a certain idea of public memory, of one major, massive, collective memory that should be followed by everybody. But collective public memory, you have different public, you have different groups, you know. Public memory is memory of a group, and you have the nation as a group, you have nations, you have ethnical groups, you have community in villages. So you have different types of public memory. And those different groups have different ways to cope with crisis. This is cultural, this is also historical, you know. Not all the places and all the groups have the same history. And that's right. So it really depends of what and who is using this public memory. How do we imagine the future is a bit the same, you know. Digital artifact, cultural heritage are something extremely important for the young generation, but it's something which is very easily, you know, used to create myth and narration, and again, you know, single narration, which kind of homogenize the past. And when you have this homogenization of the past, this is never a really good sign. And that's the same, you know, for this digital present in connection to the past. If you train with a historical, you know, mind and this way of questioning all the time, that should train you to be aware, you know, to be careful about all this information circulating on the internet. But it's not always the case, because this digital presence is also a massive weapon to spread news and to spread version of history. So again, it depends who is behind and which group, which people we are talking about. And this brings us to basically two conceptions of history. There may be many more, but I would say that's our two pillars. One conception of history, see history as having as a task to define the nation, you know, to give a frame, to define a sort of culture, and to present the past as something fixed. So you write a book, you know, of your country, of your nation, you define things, you have the book, you give it to people, and people read it and learn it. But you can also look at history as basically something which have to deconstruct those definitions. It does not mean that the definition should not exist, because to deconstruct something, you need those things to exist. But history is not made to define the nation. History is made to question those definitions, because nations, cultures are changing. You know, people are changing. French nation nowadays is not the same than a century ago, and it's the same for the culture. So a historian should always question those concepts and look for answers. Why did they evolve, and why are they like this now? Why were they like that before? And this type of history is a very open, you know, field. And of course, it should give place to the subalterns, which are basically everybody which is excluded from the main narrations. Minorities, religious minorities, sexual minorities, gender, you know, minorities. And this conception of history impact the present, not, you know, in the way that the present is linked to the past, but it impacts the present because it redirects the way, the path that a country is taking. And it's quite common and probably quite sane to have that. You know, you don't stay in the same direction, say it for decades. Various changes, various things that we find about the past, everything that we find that is important to talk about now, that was not the time to talk a few decades ago. And I will finish on one example, just to show you what could be, you know, this type of redirection. I know a lot of things, as everybody, about the Second World War in Indonesia. And we have a lot of books written about it. But at the same time, we do not know a lot. And we do not know a lot about comfort women. We know it existed. We know the system behind. We know those women were victims. We know more or less how the system have been implemented and what were the conditions which allow that system, you know, to continue to work. But we do not know, or we haven't questioned enough, why are the conditions which allow the shame to continue on women nowadays, women which were victims of this system. And of course, the research, and this is something we should be very happy about, but the direction of history and the vision that we have in Indonesia of comfort women, it seems still something very taboo. And if we could wish for one type, you know, of redirection, of reimagining this future, would be to reimagine what could be the place of women which has been victim of war or violence, and who now speak up, or who you know, spoke up for decades, but who are not given the right place and the right status. So I would finish on that note, and I hope that we can have a fruitful discussion during the question and answer. I also hope that I have not been, you know, just rambling about some concept, and that it will allow us to talk more later. Thank you.